You're acting yourself. I'm Anthony Mallaby, the younger son of Brigadier Mallaby, and in October 1945, when he was killed, I was just over 6 years old.
And I'm Christopher Mallaby, and at that date I was 9 years old.
He was a scholar, a classicist, a linguist, and a very competent soldier, an immensely competent staff officer in particular. He was born in 1899 and he joined the Indian Army in 1917, passing first, top, into the Indian Military Academy and out of it, top. And he was commissioned into the 2nd Punjab Regiment, a regiment of Indian soldiers, mainly Muslims. And he loved that life. He had enormous fun, he thoroughly enjoyed it. His early years were spent in southern Russia. After the end of the First War, the British sent troops into Baku and the Caucasus to, I don't know what, but to counter the Reds, I imagine. And he served there as a young officer. After that, he served on the northwest frontier of India in Waziristan in a frontier campaign. But he then passed into the Staff College in England, which was unusual for an Indian Army officer because they had their own Staff College in India. And after that, his career seriously took off, and he became known as one of the brightest brains in the Indian Army, and was one of only 2 officers in the Indian Army to be stolen, really, by the British Army. They took the 2 cleverest, and he was working in the War Office, in the Central Directorate of Military Affairs in 1939, and he was a captain. A year later, he was a brigadier, and about a year after that, he was a Major General in India. He tried to get away from the War Office to go and fight, and he came down a rank from brigadier to colonel to command a regiment to go and fight in Burma. And he went out to India to join that regiment, and the commander-in-chief, Lord Wavell, said, "You're wasted doing that, you come here," and made him a general and made him director of military operations. Big, very important job. And our father decided that since he was a career soldier and he'd not yet held a proper active command as a senior officer, he had, of course, as a junior officer, he felt he should revert 1 rank down to brigadier and command a brigade in action. So that is what he did, and he commanded one of the spearhead brigades for the reinvasion of Malaya. And of course, en route to Malaya, the atom bombs were dropped on Japan, and so they stormed ashore over empty beaches. And then we know about the rest. They were sent off to Java much later in October 1945. It had a British brigadier, himself a British second in command, someone called Colonel Lewis Pugh, an immensely experienced officer, much decorated for gallantry, not universally liked, but universally respected as a very competent officer. There would have been a brigade headquarters of young staff officers, probably 3 of them, and certainly 2 of them were killed during the battles. And then under him, as a normal brigade, would have had 3 regiments of infantry and some attachments of light tanks and armored cars, and some attachment also of artillery. But it was a self-contained unit. It could operate on its own. And in total, it's about 4,500 ranks. But the soldiers in this brigade were almost entirely Indian soldiers. And I think that's rather an important point because of the political problems that they are created.
Could you explain that?
Yes. Britain had made some promises and some intimations to Congress in India that independence would come. And here were we in October 1945 using Indian troops apparently to suppress a nationalist movement in somebody else's empire. And the Indians did not like that, were worried by it. And indeed, Indian dockers in the docks, I don't know which dock city, but in India, refused to load ships that were destined for Java.
Perhaps that's the moment to talk about why the British went into Java. And I think the first thing is to disarm and repatriate the Japanese forces. You forget, looking back, but at that time it was not known whether Japanese forces strewn across Asia would obey the Japanese surrender. There was a possibility that they would cause military problems. So that was the first thing. The second thing was to liberate the internees, of whom there were very large numbers. There were 79,000 Dutch and others too, and there'd been some murder. Some had been killed by Indonesian nationalists. So it was very important to go in and save them from further serious trouble. And the third thing was to re-establish peaceful conditions in Java so that in due course a civilian administration could come back. Well, I think that the British did not have sufficient intelligence about the independence movement. There are some reasons for that. One is that the responsibility for that part of South Asia was transferred very late, in late August 45, from General MacArthur's American operations to Admiral Mountbatten's British responsibility. And there wasn't therefore very much notice between the very decision that the British should go and the action in which my father was killed. So that's a big part of the background. They certainly knew that there was an independence movement, and they certainly knew that it had been supported and aided by the Japanese. The Japanese had given a lot of arms to the Indonesian nationalists, and also the Indonesian nationalists had stolen many more from the Japanese.
Yes.
It was also known that Sukarno and Hatta had been friendly with the Japanese, cooperating with them to at least some extent. I think it was not known that the ordinary younger independence people, the Pemuda, were unwilling to obey the more moderate leaders like Sukarno.
It's perhaps important to make the point that Mountbatten, who had overall responsibility out there, was very clear that he had two options. One was to fight a full-scale war on behalf of the Dutch, which he had neither the resources nor the political right to do, and the other was to negotiate.
When he arrived, the first thing they did was to start talking to the nationalists, as well as deploying soldiers from 49 Brigade around the city, partly to liberate Dutch internees.
His orders were, I think, perfectly clear, and they were to restore control in the city and find and repatriate internees and prisoners of war. And that is what he sought to do by, first of all, getting control of the city. And you don't control the city by sitting in the docks. You've got to get out and dominate it. But he really, I think more than anything else, relied on diplomacy and talking, listening with the local leaders to try and reach agreement. And they set up what I think was called the Contact Bureau, the minutes of which exist somewhere. I think I've seen a copy of them. He relied much more on diplomacy, quiet diplomacy, than on force.
The date was the
25th.
25th of October 1945, and they arrived at the port in Surabaya, and they did two things. One was to make contact with the local nationalist leaders and to try and talk about how they could do their job in Surabaya, but also to deploy parts of the brigade around the city in order, as Anthony said, to begin to assert control and to pacify the city, but also in order to enable the Dutch internees to come out and go to the port safely.
In his last letter home, written on the 27th of October, I will quote this. "Last night we made a surprise jump on the local jail and secured control of a number of internees. Many of these have been got away quickly. There are also some thousands of women and children and some hundreds of men in various areas of the town. These are Dutch or Eurasian. I am trying to collect them all in one area and give them protection, but it is a big job and a long business getting houses cleared for them. However, some of it is done today, and I hope to complete the job tomorrow. I think I've got enough troops in these areas to prevent any sort of massacre tonight. The situation is, at the moment, both obscure and explosive." So he was well aware of what was happening, obviously, in the city, and he regarded the rescuing of internees as his prime objective. And that is why he pushed his brigade out from just holding the docks in the city, the docks of the city, out into the city itself, in order to find, to liberate, to protect, and to guard the internees, many of whom had already, before the arrival of the brigade, been massacred. And it was to prevent more of that happening that he sought to occupy key points in the city itself.
Knew that there was a massacre going on.
I don't know whether they knew details of what had happened, but certainly they knew that the situation was extremely dangerous, and that massacres had happened. Whether they had details of them or not, I don't know, but they were aware that there had been bloodshed.
That's very interesting. This letter was written to you,
To my mother.
to your mother.
Yes.
Right.
And he goes on to say that the city has a population variously estimated at anything from 300,000 to half a million, and that there are several thousands who have arms of various kinds. They control all the public utilities and patrol the streets in large and dangerous numbers. However, in spite of that, he did seek through diplomacy to find a solution and to find a way of working with the locals. And he had reached some sort of agreement with Mustopo and Bong Tomo and the local leaders. And he had the city under some degree of control until really the 27th, when the famous leaflets were scattered all over the city. We don't know what briefing our father was given. We have no knowledge of that. I have never found or seen any minutes of conferences at the divisional headquarters level where those briefings are accorded. But certainly intelligence was virtually nil, wasn't it? I mean, nobody really had the slightest idea.
So
of
probably
what
there
going
was
to
some,
happen.
there must have been some surprise. But what you say about a hornet's nest is
right.
a fair description. And so the attempt had to be made both to negotiate and to try to control the city and pacify. But then came this disastrous action on the 27th of the leaflets dropped by the British demanding the surrender of all arms. And that was seen, at least by the rank and file of the Pemuda, as undermining the credibility of my father's attempt to negotiate a truce. And there was an Indonesian Pemuda offensive that afternoon, which derived partly at least from the leaflets. The leaflets had been sent by the divisional headquarters, by the headquarters senior to my father's headquarters, and he had not been consulted or informed that they would be dropped.
He knew of the existence of the leaflets, but they were printed in readiness should they ever be required, and they proclaimed a military government with my father as military governor. They proscribed the carrying of arms and made death the penalty for doing so. Very inflammatory stuff, and it was quite against his knowledge or his wishes that this should happen. And I mean, I will quote from his last letter, if I may. He says, referring to the fact that he had the city under some control, he said, although there were wearing and maddening delays in getting anything done, we were getting by degrees what we wanted, and at least we succeeded in getting troops into the most important part of the city without argument. This morning, so that's the 27th of October, contrary to my wishes, a plane came over and dropped copies over the city of a proclamation. This sets up a military government under me and makes death the penalty for carrying arms. It was for use only when needed, but now it has utterly ruined all that I have done. So he understood full well that the trust that he had built up with the Indonesian leaders was destroyed, and of course it was exactly what the hotheads wanted, and was their excuse to really start laying waste and creating mayhem around them.
Who was responsible for this leaflet dropping?
General Hawthorne, who was commanding the division. He gave the order. And I knew one member of his headquarters staff, and he told me years and years later that he and various others had tried to stop it happening, but Hawthorne had gone ahead and insisted.
So battle began really on the 28th after the leaflets, and then came a high-level attempt to negotiate a truce. Sukarno and Hatta arrived on the next day, the 29th, and they broadcast an appeal for calm and a ceasefire, and there was a tour of the city by my father and the commander of the Indonesian Nationalist Force. And so at that point, the disaster which had begun to happen was held for a matter of hours by negotiation.
And Mustopo agreed to broadcast that afternoon asking for calm, but he never appeared at the microphone, and his place was taken by some hothead from Pemuda who broadcast in quite the opposite sense. And the city after that really was uncontrollable. But don't forget, my father just had 4,000 troops, that's all. I have no idea how it was coordinated. I don't know what central control there was within Pemuda. All we do know is that there were what were taken, I suspect, at the time to be very spontaneous uprisings by very volatile, well-armed gangs of youths who were spoiling for a fight. And they realized their superiority in numbers, and they were infuriated by the dropping of the leaflets. They were in possession of arms, and they were damn well going to use them.
So all of a sudden, all the odds were against 49 Indian Infantry Brigade.
Completely isolated and small, 4,000 people against estimated 120,000.
Yes, I mean, there's even been bigger estimates than that at that moment, because there were a lot of people on the streets who were not counted in the 120,000 nationalist armed forces. One of the estimates I've seen is that the 49 Brigade was outnumbered by 23 to 1 that day.
And there they were, trying to find and rescue internees and prisoners of war. So necessarily in some fairly small packets of people. And many of them were set upon and never seen again. My father's chief staff officer, what is called his brigade major, was sent off on some errand, and he was never ever seen again. Vanished.
Killed, probably.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
How many of your father's men got killed?
Well, all I can tell you is that his brigade suffered more casualties in about 4 days in Surabaya than it had in the whole of the Burma campaign. I can't give you a figure, but that is an order of magnitude. It's pretty astonishing.
It must have been hundreds.
Very, very high casualty figures.
Let's say tens, hundreds?
Hundreds. Yes.
We know that the car left with senior Indonesian nationalists and my father, that somehow they were separated later. The car got stuck in the crowd on the square in front of the International Building, and there were some British Indian forces, I think it was a company of Marathas inside the building, and the crowd was there, and there was some shooting, and the 3 British officers in the back of the car, including my father, were not hit, and they feigned death for, I don't know how long, a couple of hours, I think.
Yes, it was quite a long time.
And eventually
They had been disarmed by then too.
Yes. One of them had hidden a grenade, which later plays a role in the story. And so later, some very young Pemuda activists, armed, came close to the car, and my father he did ask for contact with a senior nationalist, yet another attempt to get a peaceful solution, a non-violent solution. But the young Indonesian nationalist, who may have been as young as 17, shot him dead. The other 2 British officers one of them threw the grenade, which probably killed the assassin, and they escaped in the turmoil of the grenade, and they swam from the main river just there back to the port. Meanwhile, the company of British Indian soldiers in the International Building had not been ordered to fire by my father, but in the end, the Indian major in charge of them,
called Major Venugopal,
he did order them to fire, and so that was the next big development.
It was one of the escalation of violence.
They were under threat, these soldiers. There was a mob storming the building, and at that point they did fire.
They had to take the decision to do so. But prior to that, our father had, whilst touring the city, he had got out of the car and walked across the square with the crowd raging all round him to the International Building, very brave, to shout at the company commander, Venugopal, to hold his fire for as long as he could and to just keep the situation where he possibly could as calm as possible. And it was when he was walking back to the car that things really got nasty and really got ugly. The Indonesian leaders vanished at this point, and the three officers, Captain Shaw, Captain Lachlan, and my father, were all three disarmed, and their personal weapons were removed, but Lachlan, I think it was, managed to secrete this grenade in his pocket or somewhere. And then they, after our father's death, they jumped into the Kali Mas, as Christopher says, and swam to safety. They were mistaken for enemy by a Gurkha unit on a bridge, and were fired at, and grenades were thrown at them, but they were slightly wounded. The company commander who rescued them was called Reed, and again, I knew him later.
Mm-hmm.
He was a nice man.
Well, I think he had a fantastically difficult task with a small number of soldiers facing a very large number of armed nationalists. He had a double purpose, which was negotiation and pacification on the one hand, and the restoration of order and the liberating of the internees, mainly Dutch, on the other hand. And it turned out that for various reasons it was not possible to do both those things. And when negotiation failed, there was a bloody ending to the story. One reason for that is that the rank and file Pemuda did not obey the truces that had been negotiated. Another reason for that is the notorious leaflets. But of course, a fundamental reason is that the British force was immensely outnumbered.
I also think it was, of course, at the human level, it was the most appalling waste of life, not only his, but the other soldiers as well. And getting caught up in somebody else's quarrel is, of course, the very worst thing that can happen to you. And it cut short a very promising career, very fine career, and was a dreadful waste of resources and human lives.
Could you explain this somebody else's quarrel, please?
Well, it's somebody else's quarrel. It was a quarrel between the Dutch and the Indonesians. It was not the British, not our quarrel, nor was it a quarrel between the Indian Army and the Indonesians. It was, one has to remember the complete chaos that reigned across Southeast Asia throughout what the Japanese called their co-prosperity, Southeast Asian co-prosperity sphere. It was chaos, disaster. All public utilities were run down, everything was broken, nothing worked. People were homeless, there wasn't enough food, there wasn't water, there wasn't sanitation, there was no medical equipment or supplies. People were dying like flies. And Southeast Asia, with its teeming millions, was in total chaos. And to get caught up in all of that with inadequate resources, especially when it was not your ultimate responsibility, it was the responsibility of the Dutch, was a tragedy.
So why did the British do it? The answer is that somebody had to do it. There were Japanese forces in Indonesia and there were Dutch internees. And the Netherlands were not in a position at that point to go back. They were not strong enough after the Nazi occupation. So the Americans and the British were the viable forces in Asia, and the British were given that piece of Asia as part of their responsibility. Yes, politically, it was in the terms of the time understandable, even unavoidable because of the Japanese forces there. But the way it was done caused tragedy, including for my family.
I mean, Mountbatten did say to me, I remember his words, he said, you don't bump off the senior officer and think you can get away with it, especially if you are an illegal regime. He was given a very, very hard task to perform, which he did with great gallantry. And I think his men also, right down to very junior leader level, performed with much bravery. Yes.
This story had been the headlines in the British newspapers for quite a few days. And then at the end he was killed. And I was at school that day and I was taken home and told what had happened. Anthony was at home all the time. And it certainly was a controversy. There was a certain amount of discussion in the House of Commons. There was a great deal of media attention in Britain. And on the spot in Indonesia, the British, having tried negotiation and pacification, resorted after my father's murder to the Battle of Surabaya, which was a very nasty affair, which was won militarily, but probably in psychological terms was a boost in the end to Indonesian nationalism. I was fetched from school, it was about a 5-mile drive, by a relative and taken home without being told what had happened. And when I went home, I went into my mother's bedroom and she told me. And I suppose that when you're told that at the age of 9, you don't absorb it properly for a little time. It wasn't, in one way, a surprise, because where we lived was a town called Camberley, about 30 miles from London, which was a military centre. It had 2 immense military training colleges and other military presence. And a lot of my school friends had lost their fathers earlier in the war, particularly in the battles in Normandy and Northern Europe in 1944.
Our mother, I might say, heard the news on the 8 o'clock BBC news broadcast that her husband had been killed.
And how did she react?
With typical courage. She rang the India office to find out if the report was true. And she was told that in the absence of any other information, it was to be assumed that it was true. And indeed it was. The BBC was not censured for what they had done, but there were questions in the House of Commons as to their conduct in broadcasting the news of the death of a senior officer before next of kin had been informed. But what they did, which made it so much worse, was they speculated on the manner of his death. And that, I think, was really bad. They speculated that he had been shot or that he had been torn to bits by a crowd, and I think that was unforgivable.
There was much discussion about the incident and about the Indonesian story as a whole. There was also much about my father. We've had, at the time, my mother had many, many letters from the top people in the British Army and from political figures. Anthony Eden was the Foreign Secretary, he was a friend of my father. He raised the matter in Parliament. So there was a great deal of support for him from people who had known him. And over the years, there have been various attempts to write seriously about the story and to analyse it convincingly.
You met Sukarno once, didn't you?
Yes, I met him years later when I was a diplomat, and there was a faint recognition, I think, of the name Mallaby, but no conversation.
No conversation about it, no.
But I've often heard Indonesians whom I've encountered in my diplomatic life talking about the incident. I've never heard any criticism of my father, but perhaps they wouldn't say that to me. I've certainly heard criticism of the British intervention as a whole.
I think Sir Philip Christensen, who was the commander of land forces, had been given the task by Mountbatten just to teach these people a lesson. And anyway, Mountbatten had been told to restore order, create order for the orderly return of the civil government. And clearly that was not happening. He had to do it. And so Christensen put in a whole division into Surabaya, and street by street, building by building, the Indonesians and mainly Indian Army soldiers fought it out. And inevitably the disciplined British division, Indian Army division, triumphed at a considerable loss.
It was a very violent battle.
War is violent. War is violent.
But it was not an easy walkover.
No, it wasn't.
That's right.
That's right. The Indonesians fought very hard and with great passion. And they saw it as their opportunity to rid themselves of the hated Dutch.
But then, after the British had done all that, and elsewhere also in Indonesia there had been the re-establishment of public order, the Dutch came back, and the rest of the story is a Dutch-Indonesian story, which it should have been in a way all through, and Indonesia got independence. I saw him moving quickly through our sitting room to get in his car and go, and I saw him depart in the car. And my recollection is, and I think it's accurate, that the last thing he said to me, rather in passing, not making a big point of it, was, "You look after Mummy."
And that was the last time she saw him. 1943. A number of people have said to me that the two things that mattered to him most in his life were his profession as a soldier and his family. And he was, above all, a family man, I think.
You know what's written on his grave. More brave for this that he has much to love. That meant us.